What if a single act of compassion, buried beneath the ashes of war, could echo across an entire lifetime? In 1968, the jungles of Vietnam burned under an unforgiving sun. The air carried the weight of fear, smoke, and prayers whispered into the chaos. Villages once filled with laughter and children's songs were silenced by the thunder of bombs. Amid that storm of noise and fire stood a young Marine named John Metzler. He was just 23, a small-town boy from New York, sent halfway across the world to fight in a war he barely understood. Like so many soldiers, he had been told he was there to protect freedom. But on that day in the ruins outside Da Nang, freedom looked nothing like victory. It looked like destruction. It looked like a loss. And then through the smoke and rubble, he heard it. The faint cry of a child. High, fragile, human. John froze. In the middle of a battlefield, surrounded by shouting men and distant gunfire, that single sound pierced through the noise like a heartbeat. He followed it, climbing over the broken remains of what had once been a small home. Beneath the wreckage, a small hand reached out, trembling, covered in dust. He dropped his rifle. Kneeling, he dug through the debris with his bare hands until he uncovered her, a little Vietnamese girl, her dark hair tangled, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her tiny chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. John didn't hesitate. He lifted her carefully, his heart pounding. "It's okay," he whispered, though she couldn't understand his words. "You're safe now." In that moment, the war around him faded. The explosions became distant echoes. The smoke, the noise, the orders, all disappeared. All he saw was the child in his arms, trembling but alive. He carried her toward the field hospital, running past soldiers and medics who shouted directions he barely heard. For a brief instant, he wasn't a Marine. He wasn't a soldier. He was simply a man trying to save a life. He didn't know her name. He didn't know if she would live. But he knew one thing. This was the moment that would stay with him forever. A single act of mercy in a place built for war. John Metzler stood outside the field hospital, his uniform soaked in sweat and dust, his hands trembling from exhaustion. Inside, medics worked frantically over the little girl he had carried from the ruins. Through the thin canvas walls, he could hear her crying, soft, broken sobs that cut deeper than any wound he'd ever received. He didn't even know her name. All he knew was that she was alive, and for that he was grateful. When the doctor emerged, John rushed forward. "Will she make it?" he asked. The man nodded. "She's lucky. A few more minutes and she wouldn't have survived." John exhaled slowly, his chest tightening. He looked down at his hands, blood, dust, and fragments of wood still clinging to his skin. In the chaos of war, everything felt uncertain, but for that one child at least, something good had survived. He didn't realize it then, but that moment would become the most vivid memory of his service, more lasting than medals, more haunting than nightmares. That night, as the camp quieted and the jungle filled with the hum of insects, John sat by a dim lantern, staring at a small piece of paper, a photo of his unit taken days before. On the back he scribbled 3 words, "The little girl." It was all he could write, all he could hold on to. The next morning, new orders came. His unit was moving out toward another village. He asked if he could see the girl one last time, but the medic shook his head. "She's stable," he said. "Rest now, Marine." So John packed his gear and left. He never saw her again. As his convoy rolled out, he looked back once, toward the hospital tent fading in the distance. He tried to memorize its shape, the way the morning light hit its canvas, the faint trace of smoke still curling above the trees. Somewhere inside that tent, a little girl was waking up to a new day. In the months that followed, war swallowed everything. Days blurred into nights. Friends were lost. Orders changed. And yet through it all, he couldn't shake the image of her small face beneath the rubble, those frightened eyes staring up at him, the sound of her breath returning as he carried her to safety. Sometimes in the middle of patrol, he'd hear the echo of her cry. He'd close his eyes for just a second, as if to promise himself she was all right. In war, mercy was rare. But for John, that brief moment had been enough to remind him why his heart still mattered. He didn't save a nation that day. He didn't win a battle. He simply saved a life, one he would never forget. And though he didn't know it yet, the memory of that child would follow him home, across oceans and decades, until the day their paths crossed once more. When the war finally ended, John Metzler came home to parades and handshakes. But the cheers faded quickly, and the silence that followed was deafening. The sound of gunfire, the smell of smoke, the faces of the men he'd lost, all of it lingered like ghosts he couldn't leave behind. He tried to rebuild his life. He married, found steady work, and built a small home in upstate New York. From the outside, it looked like peace, but on the inside, the war was still there. It followed him into quiet moments. In the hum of a lawnmower, in the crack of thunder, in the distant cry of a child playing in the street, each sound pulled him back to that day in Da Nang, that day when he heard a cry, not of fear, but of life, buried under rubble. Some memories fade. Others carve themselves so deep they become part of you. For John, the little girl in the rubble became that memory. He never learned her name, never saw her again, but she lived in his mind with the clarity of a photograph he could never put away. Every year on Veterans Day, John would sit at his kitchen table, medals spread out before him. Some were for bravery, others for service. But none of them meant as much to him as that one memory, the moment he saved a child. Sometimes his wife would find him staring out the window, lost in thought. "What are you thinking about?" she'd ask gently. He'd smile faintly. "Vietnam," he'd say. "Someone I met there." He never told her the full story, not because he didn't want to, but because words couldn't carry the weight of what he felt. It wasn't a story about war or duty, it was about a promise, a quiet, unspoken promise that one day he hoped the little girl had grown up safe. Years turned into decades. The world changed. Vietnam became a memory on the news, a chapter in history books. But for John, it never truly ended. He kept a small metal box tucked away in his drawer. Inside it, an old map of Da Nang, a unit photo, and that same piece of paper with 3 faded words, "The little girl." Sometimes he wondered if she ever thought of him. Did she remember the man who carried her from the rubble? Did she even know he existed? He would never know, he told himself. The world was too big. Too many years had passed. But somewhere, deep down, he couldn't let it go. Because while the war had taken many things from him, friends, peace, sleep, it had also given him something rare, a moment of grace, a reminder that even in the darkest places, compassion could still survive. And though he didn't know it yet, that compassion, that single act, was about to find its way back to him. Her name was Thuong, though for many years she wouldn't remember it clearly. The explosion that tore through her village had taken nearly everything, her home, her family, and much of her early memory. For a long time, all she remembered was a man's face, an American soldier, covered in dust, his eyes filled not with hatred, but with something she would later recognize as mercy. After the war, Thuong was moved from one refugee shelter to another. Her small frame and quiet nature made her easy to overlook, but she was strong, stronger than most realized. She learned to survive on little, to listen more than she spoke, and to carry her grief in silence. Years later, a local nurse took her in, a widow who had lost her own son in the fighting. The woman gave Thuong a home, a roof, and, most importantly, a chance to begin again. She helped her go to school, to learn to read and write, to build a life out of the ashes of what had been destroyed. Thuong grew up with questions that no one could answer. Who was the man who saved her? Why did he risk his life for a child he didn't know? Sometimes she wondered if he was real at all, or just a dream created by her mind to survive the trauma. But in her heart, she believed. She remembered his hands, trembling but gentle. She remembered his voice, foreign, yet calming. "You're safe now," he had said. Those words stayed with her. They became her foundation, the quiet strength she carried into adulthood. She became a nurse, just like the woman who had cared for her. And every time she held a frightened child's hand, she thought of him, the American who showed her that kindness could exist even in war. As Vietnam rebuilt, Thuong built with it, her heart full of both sorrow and gratitude. She never stopped wondering what had happened to the man who saved her. And across the ocean, in a quiet home in New York, that same man was wondering the very same thing. Two lives, two worlds, bound by a single moment neither could forget. By the time John Metzler entered his 60s, the war had long faded into history books and memorial walls. But for him, it never truly ended. He lived a quiet life in upstate New York, mornings spent tending the small garden behind his house, evenings by the radio, listening to old songs from the 60s. To his neighbors, he was a kind, reserved man. Few knew about the nightmares that sometimes woke him before dawn, flashes of gunfire, smoke, and that little girl's face in his arms. He had saved many lives during his tour in Vietnam, but hers was different. He had carried her through the chaos, whispering that she would be okay, yet he never knew what became of her. Was she alive? Did she remember him? Every year on the anniversary of that day, he would take out an old photograph, a faded snapshot of himself in uniform, taken just days before the attack near Da Nang. He'd look into the eyes of the young man he once was and whisper, "I hope she made it." For decades, John never spoke publicly about his memory. The war for him wasn't something to glorify. It was something to learn from, to heal from. But one afternoon, at a local veterans gathering, he finally told the story. "I carried a little girl out of the rubble," he said softly, eyes fixed on the floor. "She couldn't have been more than 6. I don't know what happened to her. I just hope she lived." A journalist from a regional newspaper overheard. She asked for permission to write about it, a small piece about humanity in wartime. John agreed, though reluctantly. "If it helps someone remember," he said, "then maybe it's worth telling." The article ran online in late 2012 under the title, "The Soldier and the Child He Never Forgot." Thousands read it, many moved to tears. Among them was a Vietnamese American reader who shared it on local Vietnamese news pages, a small act of compassion that would set off a chain reaction. Half a world away, in Ho Chi Minh City, a woman scrolling through her phone stopped at that same article. Her heart pounded as she read the words, the year, the place, the memory. A soldier, a child. Da Nang, 1968. Her hands trembled. The story matched hers, the one her adoptive mother used to tell when she was little. Thuong froze. Could it be him? For 45 years she had lived with a single image, a soldier's trembling hands lifting her from the dust. And now his name was right in front of her, John Metzler. That night Thuong couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, the glow of her phone screen reflecting in her eyes, reading and rereading the article again and again. Every detail matched what she remembered, the year, the city, the bombing near Da Nang. Her heart told her it was him, but her mind whispered doubt. Could fate really be that kind? She showed the article to her husband the next morning. He read it quietly, then looked up and said, "You have to try. If it's him, he deserves to know you lived." For the first time in years, Thuong felt the same spark of hope that had kept her alive as a child. She gathered everything she had, old adoption papers, photos from the orphanage, the scars on her arm from the rubble. Each piece of her past was a fragment of a puzzle she was finally ready to solve. Through friends in the Vietnamese American community, she contacted the journalist who had written the article about John Metzler. The woman was stunned when she read Thuong's message. "I think I am the girl he saved," she wrote simply. Within days, the journalist arranged a video call between Thuong and John's family. The moment his face appeared on her screen, her breath caught. The years had changed him. Gray hair, deeper lines, but the same eyes, the same warmth. John blinked in disbelief. "Thuong?" he whispered, as if afraid to break the spell. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You saved me," she said softly, "in 1968, near Da Nang." For a long moment neither spoke. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the sound of two hearts remembering. John's hands trembled. "I prayed for you every night," he said. "I thought you were gone." "I'm here," Thuong smiled through tears, "because of you." The call lasted hours. They spoke through translators and tears, piecing together the fragments of memory that had lived in both their hearts for 45 years. When the call ended, John sat in silence, overcome. His wife placed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "You found her." Word of their reunion spread quickly. The journalist's follow-up story, the soldier and the girl reunited after 45 years, touched millions around the world. Messages poured in from strangers who said it restored their faith in humanity. For John and Thuong, it wasn't about headlines or attention. It was about closure. It was about love that had survived war, time, and distance. And soon both knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. For days after their first call, John Metzler couldn't stop replaying it in his mind. The sound of her voice, the way she smiled through tears, it was proof that something good had survived the war. He sat on his porch one morning, holding the old photo of himself in uniform. "I never thought I'd have a reason to go back," he murmured. But now he did. Returning to Vietnam had always felt impossible. The memories were too heavy. The heat, the noise, the ghosts that still lived in his mind. But this time, it wasn't about the past. It was about finishing something that had begun with a single act of compassion nearly half a century ago. When he told his family, they were silent for a moment. Then his son said, "Dad, you have to go." His wife nodded. "She's waited her whole life for this." In early 2013, John packed his bag, light, just a few clothes, and the photo he'd carried for 45 years. At the airport, he felt both nervous and calm, as if destiny itself were guiding him back. The flight to Vietnam was long, but his mind was clear. He looked out over the ocean and whispered a quiet prayer for peace, for healing, for all the lives lost. When the plane touched down in Da Nang, the air felt familiar, the same warmth, the same scent of rain and earth. But this time, there were no gunfire, no chaos, only stillness. And waiting beyond the gates, surrounded by reporters and well-wishers, was Thuong, the little girl he once carried from the rubble, now a grown woman. John took a deep breath, his heart trembling. After 45 years, he was finally home. The sun hung low over Da Nang, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Crowds had gathered quietly outside the small cultural center where the meeting was to take place. Cameras clicked, journalists whispered. But when John Metzler stepped through the doorway, the world seemed to fall silent. Across the room, Thuong stood waiting. Her hands trembled. For a moment, time folded in on itself. 1968 and 2013 became one. The little girl buried beneath the rubble and the man who had lifted her from death's grip were together again. John stopped a few steps away. His lips parted, but no words came. His eyes searched her face, the same faint scar on her left cheek. She smiled softly, tears glistening. "Hello, John," she whispered, her voice breaking. He took a shaky breath, then stepped forward. "You're real," he said, his voice trembling. "You made it." When they finally embraced, the crowd around them disappeared. It wasn't a meeting of strangers, it was a homecoming. John's arms wrapped around her as if protecting that same little girl once more. Thuong clung to him, her tears soaking his shoulder. "I've carried this moment in my heart for 45 years, John whispered. "Every night, I prayed to see you again." She pulled back slightly, looking into his eyes. "You saved me," she said softly. "Because of you, I lived. I grew up. I became a nurse. I tried to help others, like you helped me." He smiled through tears, shaking his head gently. "No, Thuong, you saved me too." Around them, reporters wiped their eyes, unable to hold back the emotion of what they were witnessing. A reunion not born from war, but from love. Outside, the evening breeze carried the faint sound of children playing, laughter echoing through the streets. The sound of a country healed, of wounds finally closing. In that moment, two lives, once separated by war and time, found peace. And for John Metzler, the Vietnam he left behind was no longer a place of pain, but a place where love had survived. The next morning, John and Thuong set out together. No cameras, no interviews, just two souls retracing the path that had once changed both their lives. The air was thick with humidity and memories. They drove through winding rural roads outside Da Nang, where the jungle had reclaimed much of what war had once destroyed. The sound of cicadas filled the air, and for long stretches neither of them spoke. Words felt too small for what they were feeling. When they reached the small clearing where the village once stood, John stepped out of the car slowly. His boots pressed into the soft earth, the same soil he had walked on as a young Marine, terrified and uncertain. Thuong pointed to a cluster of trees nearby. "That's where my family's home was," she said quietly. "It's gone now, but sometimes I still dream of it." John nodded, his throat tightening. "I remember pulling you from somewhere right around here," he said, pointing toward the open field. "There was so much smoke. I thought I'd lost you." Thuong knelt down, touching the ground with her fingertips. "You didn't lose me," she said softly. "You saved me." For a long time they stood there in silence, a soldier and the child he once carried, surrounded by the echoes of their past. Later, they visited a small school that had been built near the site. The children, curious and full of laughter, ran up to greet them. Thuong smiled and handed out notebooks she had brought, while John watched. His eyes filled with pride and disbelief. "This," he said finally, "this is what peace looks like." As the sun began to set, they walked along the riverbank where the reflection of the sky turned golden. Thuong slipped her arm through his. "Do you ever regret coming back?" she asked. John smiled faintly. "No," he said. "I think I was always meant to." And as they stood there, the ghosts of war seemed to fade into the distance, replaced by something gentler, something eternal. Forgiveness. Morning sunlight spilled gently over Da Nang Bay, turning the water into ribbons of gold. The city below stirred awake, fishermen hauling in their nets, vendors setting up carts of steaming pho, the rhythmic buzz of scooters echoing through the streets. From the balcony of his small hotel, John Metzler stood quietly, taking it all in. The air was humid but soft, fragrant with salt and incense. It was a Vietnam he had never known, peaceful, alive, reborn. Behind him, the door creaked open. Thuong stepped out, carrying 2 cups of coffee, the steam rising between them. "For old times," she said with a smile. John chuckled, his weathered hands wrapping around the warm ceramic. "I'm not sure I ever had coffee this good in '68, he said. "Back then it was just instant powder and hope." Thuong laughed softly, her voice like a melody carried on the breeze. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." For a long while they sat together in silence, listening to the murmur of the sea and the distant chatter of life below. Each moment felt precious, suspended between past and present. John watched the horizon and thought about how far both of them had come, 2 souls bound by a single act of compassion, now reunited under a gentler sky. "Do you ever think," he began, his voice low, "how strange it is that one small moment, one decision, can change everything?" Thuong nodded slowly. "I do," she said. "You gave me a second life, and maybe I gave you peace." John's eyes glistened. "You did," he whispered. "More than you'll ever know." Later that afternoon they drove through the city together, passing modern cafes, glass buildings, and parks filled with children playing beneath the shade of palm trees. The laughter echoed through the open car window, and for John it sounded like healing. He turned to Thuong. "I never thought I'd see this place alive again," he said. "Back then it felt like the world would never recover." Thuong looked out at the passing streets. "It did," she said softly. "People rebuild. The land forgives us, even when we struggle to forgive ourselves." Their destination was a small memorial on the outskirts of the city, a quiet place, tucked beneath banyan trees, where stone tablets bore the names of children lost during the war. Birds chirped in the branches above, their songs delicate and mournful. Thuong carried a single white lily. She knelt before the memorial, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it at the base. The air was still, heavy with reverence. John removed his cap, pressing it to his chest. "It took me a long time to understand," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the engraved names. "War doesn't end when the fighting stops. It ends when forgiveness begins." Thuong looked up at him, eyes shimmering. "And when kindness survives," she added. They stood together for a long time, the silence between them saying everything words could not. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thuong invited John to her home, a modest apartment overlooking the river. The walls were lined with photos of her family, her husband, her children. On a small shelf stood a faded picture of a young girl and an older Vietnamese woman, the nurse who had raised her. "She taught me that compassion is the only thing that makes life bearable," Thuong said, running her fingers along the frame. "She never knew your name, but she always thanked the American who saved me." John smiled gently. "Then tell her," he said. "It was worth it." They shared dinner, simple dishes of rice, vegetables, and grilled fish. Laughter came easily now, mixed with quiet tears when the memories grew heavy. Thuong's children joined them on a video call from abroad, curious to meet the man their mother spoke of like a legend. John waved shyly at the camera, his eyes misty. "Your family now?" Thuong said after the call ended. "Always." John swallowed hard, unable to speak. He looked out at the darkening river where lanterns floated gently downstream, their lights flickering like stars set free. On the morning of his departure, the sky was pale and soft with dawn. Thuong met him at the airport, holding a small box wrapped in red silk. "A gift," she said, "something to remember us by." Inside was a wooden carving, two hands clasped together, carved from old village wood. On the bottom she had engraved a single word in both Vietnamese and English: hope. John's voice broke. "I don't deserve this." "You do?" she said, touching his arm. "Because you believed in something good, even when the world didn't." When they embraced, it was no longer the reunion of strangers, but the parting of family. He held her close, memorizing the warmth of her embrace, the rhythm of her breath, the proof that what he had done so many years ago had truly mattered. "You'll always have a home here," Thuong whispered. John smiled through his tears. "And you'll always be my reason for hope." As he walked toward the gate, he turned back one last time. She stood there waving, her figure framed by the light streaming through the glass. Not the frightened child he once carried, but a woman of grace, strength, and forgiveness. When the plane lifted off, Da Nang spread out beneath him, green and gold, alive and whole. The scars of war were still there, but beneath them lay something stronger: rebirth. John closed his eyes, letting the hum of the engines blend with the steady beat of his heart. He whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, for the girl who became a woman, for the country that had healed, and for the miracle that had brought them together again. In the end, their story was not about war or survival. It was about love, quiet, patient, enduring. It was about the moment when compassion defied chaos and changed two lives forever. And for John Metzler and Thuong, that moment, born in the smoke and sorrow of 1968, would never fade. It lived on in every act of kindness that followed, a living testament that even in war's darkest hour, humanity could still shine through. The war had once divided them. Now it was their bond, a bridge of mercy spanning 45 years that would unite them for all time.